The Red Steve has arrived, and he is corrupted. So, this is his story. It all begins long ago, right at the collapse of a once flourishing world. A world that was once home to trillions of the most advanced life form. But now, it was no more. All of them were dead. And so the gods, or the spirits of that world, in the course of only a few weeks, went from being one of the most powerful beings in the entire Minecraft universe to merely just a decayed shell of his once great former self. And so that spirit was now just an entity devoid of any world, and was left without any responsibilities over anyone or anything. Now, that sounds nice, but that also meant that he had lost most of his own personal powers, and was now very close to death. And so, he was really just lost, as suffering began to consume every single fiber of his decaying body. And he was going to die. Well, that's what he thought, until at one moment, whilst just using his final remaining powers to reach up into the sky for one last time, so that he could feel the cold breeze of air passing through his hands again, when he felt something. That's not right. There's not meant to be anything up there in the sky. And so the entity looked up to see what it was, but he saw nothing. Yet he could still feel something. So whatever it was invisible. The entity was very confused, and so he decided to pull down on that strange invisible thing up in the sky that he was holding. And thus, from that, a Steve, whom had been laid dormant within the code of the air for centuries, was suddenly awoken in the overworld. Now, that Steve, when he was summoned into the overworld, was very confused, as he had been in that strange state for a very long time. And in that time, he had forgotten everything. And so, for that reason, this Steve was just looking around this strange new world that he had just been dropped in, trying to take all of it in. And well, the entity very quickly saw this confused Steve and saw an opportunity for survival, as that being the Steve was clearly very powerful and very important, as why else would he be hidden away in the game's code like that? And so, thinking that, the entity believed that the Steve would likely be strong enough to host the entity. And if that was truly the case, and the entity was able to possess him, then the entity would be saved. And so, believing that, the entity lunged right at the Steve and attempted to possess him. And to begin with, it worked, as the Steve was beginning to become under the complete control of the entity, as both of their souls were fusing. Yes, this was it. He was going to survive now. But then the takeover just failed, as the entity was sent forcefully into a state of sleep. And so now that Steve was just standing there, being very confused at what just happened to him, as he had no idea what that being was, or even why he was attacked. But still, after standing there, not moving for over an hour, and still not seeing any answers, the Steve just decided to move on, as it probably just wasn't all that important. And so now that he had gotten over that issue, he now had another. That being that he had no idea what this place was that he was currently in. And so it was then that the Steve decided to figure out the answer to that, and thus he decided to begin exploring this world. And so it would be over the next few years that the Steve would go across the sunny savannas, through the freezing oceans, and under the blistering Badlands. And well, over those years, it was quite the challenge to undergo. It was so worth it, as everything that he saw was just so beautiful and calm. And so seeing all of this over those last years really changed the Steve and made him decide to explore even more of the world. In fact, it was then that he decided to dedicate his life to exploration. And so it'd be over the next few decades that the Steve would explore even more of the overworld, being constantly amazed with all that he would find. And this all happened whilst encountering no real issues. Well, that was until one rainy morning when everything would change for the Steve. As it was on that morning that the Steve was just running across his world when he came across a giant ravine. Now, he had seen many ravines in all of his years of exploration, but none of them had been as massive as this one. And so the Steve decided to investigate it. And well, that decision would change his life forever. As in only a few hours, he was able to venture his way down right to the very bottom of that ravine, where he would come across the largest deposit of redstone that he had ever seen. This redstone vein was unnaturally large, and so the Steve began to look around the area to see if there were some signs of other beings around this place that had placed this down. But as he began to do that, the entity was able to break through once again, and was able to partially take control of the Steve. And so with that, he gave the Steve a vision. Now, it was very blurry, as the entity's control over the Steve was rather weak. But the Steve could still very clearly make out that he was seeing himself, and that he was on a mountain of what looked to be redstone blocks, and he was just radiating power, and he almost looked like a god. But then the vision just ended as the entity was losing control, and just before it was sent back to sleep again, it said,
"You can become that, an all-powerful god. All you have to do is just get to the..."
The entity was cut off as he returned back to his dormant state. And so the Steve was now left even more confused as what had just happened there. Now, to begin with, the Steve just thought that he was seeing things, as he had just travelled through a desert and was likely just dehydrated. But still, he was curious to know more about that strange vision. And well, as seeing that vision, he was on a mountain of redstone, and right now, he was right next to a ton of redstone. He decided to mine some, as surely there must be a link between these two very strange events. And well, the very moment that he began to mine that redstone, he received a slight shock and began to feel just a bit more powerful. That was very odd, but it did make him think that maybe that vision wasn't a delusion after all, and that the entity was really telling him to collect some redstone to become a powerful god. And so he mined another to see if he would get the same effect. And well, he did. And so with that, he was now convinced that if he just collected redstone, then he would gain magical powers. And so would begin the 100,000 year exploration of the redstone. A time where the Steve would venture into every single cave that he could find, with the sole objective being to mine redstone. And well, he certainly would do quite a good job at that, as over time he was able to collect every single piece of redstone in the overworld above Y level 16. And so during that 100,000 year exploration, he had been able to collect trillions of redstone pieces. And so it was due to the fact that he carried all of these redstone pieces that he had mined that the Steve began to evolve. As over that time, he began to develop redstone powers, and those powers included the following. First, he was able to teleport through any redstone block. He was also able to activate and deactivate any redstone component at any time. He was also able to summon any redstone component in his hand out of thin air. He was also able to slow down time when he mined redstone ore. Now, none of these powers were particularly useful to the Steve, but they were quite cool. And, more importantly, they did prove something to the Steve. And that was that he was correct in his belief that redstone truly does work to make one grow stronger and become closer to that of a god. And so he continued to explore the world, collecting even more and more and more redstone, until one night when, once again, everything would change. As it was on that dark, rainy night, while the Steve was just wandering through a spruce forest, that the entity within was able to awake once again and try to take possession of the Steve. And so this time it showed the Steve the exact same vision, but it was done so without that blur. And well, the Steve was at a loss for words with what he saw, as he could still see himself, yes, but he could also see that he was never standing on any redstone blocks. Instead, he was standing in hell. And so he just stood there, speechless, as he felt that his life was all just one big lie, as he had just spent the last 100,000 years of his life wasting away, collecting redstone because of that vision, when he never even saw redstone. But at the same time, maybe it wasn't a complete waste, as while he might have been mistaken on what he saw in that vision, he had grown to love the silky smooth rock of redstone, and he had gained some quite cool powers from it. So really, it wasn't all that bad, right? Well, the Steve didn't really get the chance to think any more than that, as the entity spirit began to take control once again, as he dragged the Steve into a redstone ore, and thus he was teleported to some underground ruins. And once that had happened, the entity was forcefully returned back to its dormant state. And so, now the Steve was left even more confused, more than he ever had been before. As, who was that entity? And why do they keep doing this to him? But really, that Steve knew that there was just no use wasting his time trying to figure that out, as there was just no way that he would ever be able to figure out the answers. Instead, he knew that he should just focus on other things, such as learning what these strange ruins were that he had just been teleported to. And so, that's exactly what he would begin to do, as he would start to explore the trail ruins. And well, it didn't take him too long before he learned that these ruins were from a long-lost civilization, and that, while alive, they had many pieces of great redstone technology. And so the Steve made sure to gather up all of it, as some pieces of this redstone tech he had never even seen before, and so it was rather interesting to him. But then, as he was exploring the final room within that ruin, he came across a giant, glowing, purple portal. It was just mesmerizing, as that Steve had never seen a block glow like that before. And so he began to walk closer to it to get a better look at it. And so he continued to get closer and closer and closer to that portal, until he was standing within it. And well, as he was doing that, he began to just feel dizzy and disorientated and sick almost. But still, he didn't move. And because of that, just a few seconds later, he was transported to a whole new world. But this new world was not just any random world. No, this was the same world from his vision, the Nether. And the Steve was shocked, as at that time he almost didn't believe that the visions were real. But they were, as he was standing there in the nether right now. And so he began to get quite excited, as he started to believe that maybe this was the place where all of his godly powers had originated from. And so it was then that he was getting ready to explore this place when all of a sudden the entity attempted to break free again. And well, this attempt was the most successful one to date, as the entity was actually able to partially escape and was able to force the Steve to drop a few billion redstone dusts on the floor, just out of the sheer pain that he was forcing the Steve to endure. However, just like all the other attempts, this too failed. But it failed in the worst way possible for the entity, as the entity was dragged right back into the Steve with the might of 1,000 pistons, and all the redstone dust nearby was also dragged along. And well, due to all this redstone dust piling upon him, the entity was crushed to death. But the Steve was saved, as the death of the entity meant that all of the entity's powers, when he was at peak strength, were given to the Steve, as the entity had actually been hiding away most of his powers from the Steve for centuries, and they were now at last being released to him after the entity's death. And so that meant that the Steve could now have the abilities to fly, could break anything instantly with just his hands, and was now immortal. But quick side note here, when the entity died and all that redstone came crashing onto the Steve, enough was implanted onto his skin that he became red and began to look as if he was covered in redstone. And more than that, this redstone was just so deeply lodged within him that the redstone was never getting out. And so the Steve would forever be known from that point onwards as the Red Steve. But now, back to the Red Steve, as now, thanks to the entity's death, he had just become a god. But still, the Red Steve didn't believe that he had just gained all these great powers due to that entity that had co-inhabited his very being for the last 100,000 years. No. The Red Steve believed that it must have been the power of the redstone that had allowed him to become the grand being that he was, as he truly did believe that redstone was the source of all godly powers, and the entity was just helping him see that. And so now the Red Steve was ready to continue a search for redstone, when he realized that there was a slight problem. That being the portal, the one that had been used to take him here. Well, it was gone, as it had exploded when he had become the Red Steve. And more than that, he had no idea how that portal was made, so couldn't just make another. And so without a portal, he had no way of returning back to the overworld. And so he was stuck here in the nether. But maybe that wasn't so bad, as there might be more redstone here in the nether. And so, because he believed that it would be over the next million years that the Red Steve would travel across the entire nether, constantly looking for redstone. But he was particularly brutal in his search, as he would kill anyone that got in his way. But despite that, in all those years of exploration, he would find not a singular piece of redstone. And so really, he had just wasted the last million years looking for a substance that wasn't even in the nether. It was all for nothing. Well, almost. As over time, legends would spread across the nether about him, as occasionally another being would spot this strange Red Steve creature flying high in the sky, turning his head around in all directions, looking for something. What he was looking for, the nether beings just couldn't understand. And so those few beings that had spotted him would tell many others what they saw. Now, to begin with, many creatures within the Nether doubted the existence of this strange Red Steve, as it just sounded crazy to them. But then, when over time, sightings began to appear all across the Nether, in all different biomes, over millions of years, that opinion slowly shifted towards one of reality. And so, over time, the elusive Red Steve would become one of the Nether's most mysterious and talked about beings. Now, some feared him, others worshipped him, but one thing was certain, in that everyone knew that the Red Steve was out there, and he was still looking for elusive redstone, as the Red Steve had just never given up on his search. And very luckily for him, it would all pay off, as it was on one night, millions of years later, that a portal would finally be created once again in the Nether, allowing him to potentially return home. And so, the very moment that happened, the Red Steve could sense it, as he could smell the slight odor of redstone coming from that portal. And so, he made his way over to it, which he was able to do in only a few hours. And well, once he saw that portal, he was ecstatic, as he was finally going to be able to get more redstone. And so he ran through that portal and was teleported back to the overworld at last. Finally, he was home, and he couldn't wait to get back to that redstone collection. However, he would never be able to succeed in that, as the very moment that he took his first steps within the overworld, in well over a few million years at this point, he just imploded and became just a shiny, compacted redstone dust. And so that redstone dust that was just hovering over the ground was the compressed form of trillions of redstone pieces, and was the compressed form of the Red Steve and all of his powers. And so, that shiny redstone dust was likely the most powerful item in the entire world at that moment. And yet, it was just hovering there, alone. Well, that wouldn't be the case for too long, as very quickly, lightning would strike nearby. And from that, a monster would emerge. A monster we know as Herobrine. And Herobrine would run after that redstone dust and steal it away, and then just vanish. What? How did that just happen? Why did that just happen? Well, before we can get into all of that, we first need to learn of another special Steve, that being the Blue Steve. And so, to do that, then you'll need to watch this video.